There are places on this earth where time doesn't hold, places where the past surfaces into the present without warning, without pattern, and without leaving anything behind except the witnesses. These people spend the rest of their lives unable to explain what they saw. Tonight, I have 3 files, 3 separate locations, 3 sets of witnesses with no connection to each other, no knowledge of each other's existence or accounts, and no reason to lie. When I run all 3 against each other, they're from different countries, different centuries, different kinds of witnesses. The same structure appears every time, the same sequence, the same signature left behind in the material world. I'm calling that structure a dead zone. Let me show you where the first one starts. In 1957, a Royal Naval training base called HMS Ganges sat on the Suffolk coast of England and trained young men. Not sailors yet, these are boys and they're about 15 years old. They're learning the ropes before they enlist. William Lang was a Scottish boy. He had come down from Scotland for the training. He knew nothing about Suffolk geography. Ray Baker was to his left. He had a family in the area who knew the county well. Michael Crowley, to his right, was from Worcestershire. 3 boys from 3 different parts of England were handed a map, a compass. The task was simple. Navigate to a series of marked waypoints across the countryside, confirm position at each one, and report back by noon. They moved out into the clear October countryside. The leaves are falling down red and yellow on the ground. Lang was 15, and he'd never set foot in Suffolk County before. They approached a town called Kersey from the north, working their way down through the fields. The first thing they saw was the church tower on the hill. St Mary's, a 14th century landmark, their map confirmed as Kersey. The bells were ringing, smoke was rising from chimneys. It was a standard English Sunday. As they came down the lane towards the village, Lang described what happens next as a dead spot of sound. The bells suddenly stopped. The birds went silent. Then the wind. And the most specific thing, the detail he kept returning to decades later, was the shadows were all gone. Not reduced. Gone. The trees cast nothing on the lane, though the sun was still above them. The road had changed. It was now unpaved, dirt and packed earth. Narrow, rutted. The power lines were gone. The church tower, gone. The hill was simply a hill. None of them spoke, yet proceeded to walk in. The village was empty, not quiet. Empty. The timber frame houses had thatched roofs, and you could see that the walls were on the lean of a very old construction. No curtains were moving, no faces at windows, no sound of dogs. The boys noticed that the ducks by the stream stood motionless. Lang moved across the street until he came to a ground floor window. He looked in. 3 skinned ox carcasses were hanging on hooks, green with mould. It was not yesterday's work. It was green the way that meat goes when it's been abandoned mid-task, and whoever was working there left with urgency and never returned. He looked away from the window towards the trees. The trees had been yellow and red on the approach, full autumn. They were green now, as if it was spring. He felt what he later described as an overwhelming sense of sadness, and alongside it, the feeling of being watched. Watched from somewhere he could not locate. Crowley wanted to leave. Baker said nothing, and Lang agreed. Getting out turned out it was its own kind of problem. With haste, they walked back up the lane. The bells returned as abruptly as they disappeared. Birds returned at once, as if a switch had been thrown. The wind came back. The road became asphalt again. Power lines, and the church tower was on the hill. The trees cast shadows again in the October light. They compared notes on the walk home. Lang and Crowley agreed on every single detail. The dirt road, the silence, the carcasses, the shadows that weren't there, and the eerie feeling of being observed from inside empty buildings. Ray Barker, the boy who knew the county, who had grown up near this very village, listened to it all. He told them he wasn't sure he remembered anything about the village at all. That is a detail that makes this whole case stranger. Baker was one person in that group who should have noticed something was wrong. When a researcher tracked Baker down years later, he confirmed that nothing had stood out from that Sunday morning. Lang was from Scotland, no prior connection to Kersey, nothing that might prime him towards what he claimed to see. Crowley was from Worcestershire, same situation. Both men were permanently marked, both independently confirmed the same details decades later. Baker grew up in these fields, and he saw a village. I'm not saying this explains it. I'm saying it is the most uncomfortable detail in the whole file, because it implies something was making a selection, and I'll come back to that later. Lang completed his naval training and served. He married, and in the early 1960s he immigrated to Australia, where he built a life in a country where nobody had heard of Kersey, and no one was asking about it. But Kersey followed him. He thought about Baker, he thought about the trees with no shadows. The question he could never quite put to rest was what would happen if any of them had knocked on one of those doors. In the early 1980s, he read about a British parapsychologist named Andrew MacKenzie. MacKenzie had spent years studying retrocognition and was collecting cases with the kind of specific, variable detail Lang had been carrying for 20 years. Lang wrote him a letter. They corresponded for 2 years. MacKenzie was methodical, careful, and he believed Lang had an evidential case. He also had been spending time at the Suffolk Records Office. He wanted to show Lang exactly what he had found. In person, not by letter. MacKenzie had decided a face-to-face was the right way to deliver this particular piece of information. In 1990, William Lang flew from Australia to England. He met MacKenzie in Suffolk, and the two men walked through Kersey together. They went to the building near the stream, the one with the window, the one Lang had described in every letter. In 1990, as in 1957, it was a private residence. Nothing about it suggested any commercial history. MacKenzie opened his notes. The building had been registered as a butcher's premises. It had operated as a butcher's shop up until it was converted for residential use in 1905. Lang had described rotting carcasses hanging in a window during a visit in 1957, when the building had not been a butcher's shop for 52 years. He described a business that closed before he was born, through a window he had no prior reason to look through, on a street he had never walked. MacKenzie watched him take that in. Lang did not speak for a while. That was 1990. The documented records stopped at 1905. But MacKenzie decided to look back further. The building dated back to the early 1300s. MacKenzie explained it had functioned as a butcher's premises for the next 500 years, before somebody walked away and left the meat hanging. He could not prove back that far, however, but the evidence was consistent. What brought him to the question at the centre of the file was, on what specific day were those carcasses left? Something happened in Kersey severe enough to empty the shop, and keep it empty. The Black Death arrived in Suffolk in 1349. It killed close to half the local population. Kersey was not spared, and the church tower the boys had navigated by, the tower that had disappeared once they got inside the village, was not completed up until the 15th century. Construction had been interrupted by the plague. They had been crossing between two temporal states at the village boundary. The tower of the later century visible from the approach, and the unfinished shell of 1420 was invisible from within. That is what MacKenzie concluded, but his framework turned out to have a problem he had not anticipated. MacKenzie published these findings as the lead case in his book, Adventures in Time. His term for it was retrocognition, a psychic imprint of a traumatic past event, somehow surfacing briefly under specific conditions. The observer doesn't do the travelling, the past comes to them. The model handled Kersey well. Lang read the book in Australia, and he said it was the first time in 40 years he felt he had been taken seriously. But Lang's question, what would happen if they knocked on one of those doors, assumed something on the other side stayed still. MacKenzie's model assumed the same, a fixed imprint, a passive observer, nothing crossing between them. But what happens when the thing on the other side moves? It's November 9th, 1986, and Pedro Ramirez was the kind of man who always checked time when he left his building. He also checked it when he arrived somewhere else. As an engineer, he was precise about measurements, precise about sequence. He had driven this route from Seville to Alcalá de Guadaira every evening for 6 months without incident. 15 kilometers and 30 minutes. He knew every turn of it. On November 9th, 1986, at approximately 11:15 in the evening, he left Seville and headed home. The first part of the journey was what it always was. Then he went around a curve, and he found himself on a 6-lane highway. 3 lanes in each direction, perfectly straight, extending beyond his headlights. To his left, he saw 5 or 6 large industrial structures, all fully lit, each one perhaps 80 meters high. To his right, residential towers, approximately 20 floors. None of it on any map he knew. But he kept driving. He drove for a full hour before it got stranger. The cars passing him came at intervals of exactly 8 minutes. White, beige, dark narrow plates where the license plates should have been. The bodywork was all wrong. These were not 1986 cars. These were shapes of earlier decades. He watched them pass. Then the voices came. He described what happened next in a letter sent the following week to a Spanish researcher named Joaquin Nogales. A chorus of voices from no identifiable direction. Then one voice separating from the other. It told him he had been transferred to another hemisphere. It used the word transferred. That word is the detail Kersey does not prepare you for. Lang had wondered who might answer if he knocked. Ramirez never had to knock. Something came to him, and it had a name for the process. He drove until he found a narrow exit at the left, a triple sign, Malaga, Seville, Alcabala. He took the Seville road, drove for half an hour, and stopped the car for a reason he later could not explain. He looked out the driver's window. He was outside his front door. He needed to find where he had just been. Ramirez spent 2.5 hours driving back over the route, looking for the junction. The highway, the towers, and none of it was there. The drive from Seville to Alcalá takes 30 minutes. On November 9th, 1986, it took 3 hours and 5 minutes. He could not rationalize what he had experienced. Disoriented, confused, driving around in circles. The brain under that kind of stress does strange things. However, the fuel gauge is not rationalizable in the same way. His car had consumed the fuel equivalent of over 200 kilometers. The gauge moved because the engine ran. The engine ran because the car was moving. You cannot hallucinate fuel consumption. 2 days after the event, before speaking to anybody, Ramirez sat down and wrote everything out in a letter to a man he had never met. That letter still exists. Now, if Kersey is a fixed imprint, a moment preserved in a location, and Seville is a passage, somewhere you can be moved through without choosing it, then this next one raises a different question altogether. What happens when it's the past that refuses to stay still? 3,000 kilometers north of Seville, on a stretch of road in rural Suffolk, a house has been appearing and disappearing since 1860, nearly a century before the boys walked into Kersey. Rougham sits 16 miles west of Kersey, same flat farming country, same narrow lanes. In June of that year, a farmer named Robert Palfrey was working in his fields at dusk, when the temperatures suddenly dropped. A chill in a warm summer night with no clouds to explain it. He looked towards the road. A large Georgian house was standing in the field. Red brick, wide, formal facade, manicured gardens. Every window was lit from within. It had not been there that morning. Palfrey walked towards it. The house faded. By the time he reached the road, the field was empty. No impression in the ground, no sign anything had stood there. He did not stop talking about it until he died. His family believed him completely. His great-grandson had his own reasons for that certainty. In the summer of 1912, James Cobbold, Palfrey's great-grandson, was travelling with a local butcher named George Waylett along the same stretch of road near Rougham Green. Cobbold had grown up hearing the story of the house. He had filed it somewhere between the family legend and something that might just be true. He was about to find out for himself. The temperature suddenly dropped, and the horse reared for no reason. Waylett was thrown from his seat. Cobbold held on. In the field, where the road turned, was a house. Same red brick, same wide facade, manicured gardens. Cobbold stared at it. "You see it?" Waylett said, "Yes, I have. Twice before. It always does this to the horses." Waylett was a butcher with no patience for the inexplicable. He had seen this house appear and vanish twice before. He had not reported on it or sought an explanation. He didn't want people to consider him insane. Between Waylett's day and our own, the house has reportedly appeared to at least a dozen more witnesses. A man making deliveries in 1940, a girl cycling home in 1976, a couple in 2007 who stopped their car, got out, and walked towards the field. As they did, the house disappeared, and they found nothing. Every account says red brick, Georgian style. A sudden temperature drop first, the house, and then it fades. None of these people knew the others existed, and researchers who were working the site found fragments of red brick coated in a yellowy green mould where the sightings were reported. A little digging turned up early 18th century property maps showing the exact structure people had been explaining built in that exact same location. The name given to it was King's Hall, but no demolition records have ever been found. The house existed. Whatever removed it left no paper trail, and for over 150 years, it keeps briefly returning. 3 locations, 3 sets of witnesses with no connection to each other, all with the same pattern. A threshold, a lane, a curve, a field boundary. This is when the bells stop and the roads change. A butcher's shop in the records. A fuel gauge reading 200 kilometres. Brick fragments in an empty field where a house keeps appearing to strangers across 6 generations. Lane flew from Australia 33 years later to find an explanation. Ramirez spent 2 hours on a familiar road looking for a junction that wasn't there. Pelfrey talked about it until he died. That persistence is not confusion. It is the behaviour of people who experience something in a world where there are no answers for what they've seen. And here's the detail that sits at the back of the file. Kersey and Rougham are 16 miles apart. Same county, same red Suffolk soil. The geomagnetic properties of that region were flagged by researchers in the 90s studying anomalous phenomena known as ley lines. And Baker, MacKenzie used the word insulation, geographic familiarity, as a buffer. The threshold unable to reach, somebody who already knew what the location should look like. If that holds, the threshold is not random, it selects. Something is deciding who gets through, and that is a far more uncomfortable proposition than a ghost in a field. MacKenzie's retrocognition framework handles Kersey well. The imprint, the historical accuracy, Baker's absence. It all fits. But it requires a passive observer receiving a fixed impression. Nothing crosses between them in either direction. That doesn't hold for Ramirez. He drove through something. His car registered 200 kilometres of motion through a road no map contains. The passive observer model doesn't allow for a fuel gauge, and it doesn't hold for Rougham. The house has no connection to whoever happens to be watching. MacKenzie's model requires emotional resonance between the observer and imprint. The house seems to appear to whoever is standing there at the right place, without preference. Then there is Lang's feeling about being watched. Crowley's too. MacKenzie flagged this in his private notes as the aspect of Kersey that troubled him the most, because a retrocognitive imprint does not have awareness from its observer. If whatever Lang was looking at could also look at Lang, it is not a recording, it is a place. And if it is a place, then the voice that told Ramirez he had been transferred was not a hallucination. Something over there had a word for what happened to him. Something knew what the process was called. We are not looking at 3 separate phenomena. We seem to be looking at one phenomenon that we have not yet described correctly. Which means every witness in this file was standing at the edge of something that nobody has named yet. Lang came the closest. William Lang wrote one sentence in his correspondence with Andrew MacKenzie. "I wonder if we knocked on a door, who might have answered?" The people in Kersey in 1420 were surviving a plague that had already killed half of them. If the threshold functions in both directions, as the evidence points towards, then Lang, standing in the street, was not invisible to what was on the other side. The unseen watchers he and Crowley felt. The observation from inside the building they could not enter. Maybe that wasn't imagination. It certainly agrees with the archival research in every specific detail. 33 years later, in a building that has been closed for 52 years, when they looked through the window. Ramirez never knocked. Something came for him and used the word transferred, which means it knew what it was doing and it had done it before. And on a road in Suffolk, a practical butcher learned to factor it into his working week. The house kept returning. What was on the other side of that field kept showing up without preference, without selection to whoever happened to be passing. Lang still survives and currently is in his 80s. The last mentioned sighting at Ruffham was 2007. That stretch of road has no monitoring, no protocol, no institutional interest. Nobody is watching for the temperature drop. But the pattern says it will happen again. On an evening when the light is going and somebody is on that route, they know by heart. They round a curve or step into a field at dusk. The temperature plummets. They see something they don't have language for. And if the threshold does what the evidence suggests it does, whatever is on the other side can see back. And if this ever happens to you, pay attention to the temperature drop. It's the signal you're standing at the edge of something. Just don't knock at the door. Thanks for joining me here today, and remember, they rely on you forgetting, on you clicking away. Don't do it. Go deeper down the rabbit hole with this next video. And to make sure the signal can find you again, join the network, click subscribe, here, and keep the light alive. This is Thinkavarium.